Following on from my post about grammar in advanced levels, I'm going to do a series of further posts looking at some exercises from advanced grammar books. Now, as a writer, you might expect me to approve of all of these, including ones of my own, but that's not actually the case, because what you need to remember is that course books are a compromise between what the writer wants, what the publisher wants, and what teachers want. And often that requires having a grammar section in the course book, irrespective of how valuable it is for learners at this level. It's just a belief everybody has. Let's look at some examples and consider whether it's worth doing. The first issue with a lot of advanced grammar is that it's not actually new. Quite often what you'll realize is that what we're teaching is something that the students have seen possibly many times before, but in order to fulfill the space in the book allocated to that grammar, or to fulfill the expectations of teachers that we need to teach grammar, we end up reteaching something which they've seen, but in order to make it advanced, we try and complicate it in some ways. And you can see this in the next exercises we're going to look at. So here we have an example from Outcomes Advanced, and we are looking at what's described as ellipsis and substitution. Now that's the first element of complication, because what this actually represents is really what students already are familiar with, for example, in short answers, where a student says, "Do you like spicy food?" and the other person replies, "Yes, I do," or "No, I don't." So the first one is a substitution, and the second one is what we call ellipsis, because we include don't, but not the like spicy food. Now, in a way, we need this bigger description because what we're showing them here is not simply short answers. The other area of complication is, if we look at the examples, what's changing is I was going to take it to my room. Well, I wish you had taken it to your room. So what we're substituting here, or what we're missing out, is a change of tense. It's involving conditionality. So there's an example that, yes, this is more difficult for students to do. It is advanced, and that's fair enough. In the next exercise, we look at the meaning, some questions for the students to discuss, and then they go on to do a simple gap fill exercise. Now, students dealt with that reasonably well, and then we went on and we did this exercise where the students, to try and practice this idea, had to create 3-line dialogues using this ellipsis or substitution based on a sentence that we gave them. Now, this is where the students struggled a bit, particularly in creating dialogues which sounded reasonably natural. As teachers, when the students struggle with a task like this, we have to ask ourselves, is it that they are struggling with the grammar that is being practiced in that task? And I would say that really the answer is no. The problem is practicing this grammar is actually quite difficult. This kind of grammar could occur in pretty much any conversation. However, it's unlikely that it will happen on multiple occasions. And from the point of view of many teachers, and therefore from the point of view of many publishers, that's not really practicing the grammar. So as a result, we have to create these rather artificial practices so the students can put it to use. I mean, let's be clear, it doesn't take a huge amount of time, this exercise, but we have to recognize that probably the impact on their ability to use this grammar consistently outside of the class is going to be limited. And therefore, we might wonder if it's worth doing. Certainly, you don't want to worry if the students struggle with the task that they did here. So next, we're going to look at another grammar task from a different course book. So this exercise was drawn to my attention by a question one of my students asked in another class, and she wanted me to comment on basically the answer key of this task. And what we'll see is it again draws attention to the fact that with advanced grammar, often what we're doing is complicating basic ideas which really don't need complicating. Often it's the complication which is the struggle for students. And also that maybe we're overloading the students with kind of the rules which they won't necessarily be able to implement. So this exercise comes from Speak Out Advanced, and as you can see, it's about expressing modality. So the first task is they're matching these kinds of meanings to modal verbs, and then they apply the same to different expressions. And if we look through these, we've got things like are bound to, absolutely essential, used to have the capacity, being able to, obviously you're responsible to, etc. Now the first thing you'll notice is a lot of that language is stuff that the students will know, and really where the difficulty is in matching these simple statements to the general meanings of probability, certainty, necessity, etc. And in fact, the problem my student asked about was particularly this sentence, "It seems totally unimaginable," about whether this reflected possibility, probability, or certainty. The difficulty being, I guess, with the addition of "it seems" and the mixture with totally unimaginable, which we assume means certainly not. And then additional to that, if you think how this might be used, we would typically say, "It seems totally unimaginable that Trump could have been elected, but in fact he was." So often it's used to talk about something we didn't believe, but actually has happened. So here the complication is not from the language again, it's from trying to match it to rather vague meanings, which is difficult to do. Why do they do this? Well, because there's an expectation again, maybe from teachers, maybe from publishers, that we should always deal with meaning before we move on to practice. And in this case, I would suggest we don't need to do that, because the meaning is actually well below the level that students have acquired already. So what I would suggest is here the students just move on to the practice, where they have to write or presumably say something that is bound to happen, absolutely essential, have the capacity to, being able, etc. So basically making use of these phrases. And if the students have difficulty with the meaning, which I would very much doubt, what you can do is just get them to, in this case, translate them. And through that, they would have a better understanding of meaning than trying to differentiate between possibility and probability and certainty, when these boundaries are rather vague. Another question about this exercise then is to say, is this really grammar? Or is it just lexical phrases? And if we are thinking it's just a lexical phrase, which I would say it is, then perhaps what we have here are too many of them for the students to put to use, or at least to maybe just to focus on some key higher level ones which we think the students won't know. So what I'll look at next is maybe an example of that, just taking one or two phrases as a focus for our grammar development at higher levels. So here's an exercise from, again, Outcomes Advanced 3rd edition, and it comes under the area of developing conversations, where we look at these two phrases. It's not as though it's just that, which often go together in making an argument and defending yourself. And again, we could see this as grammar, or you could see it as a lexical phrase. It's one of those things which falls in between two stools. But what we're doing is just focusing narrowly on these two phrases and these two exchanges. Why might that be the case? Well, I think it's partly because we're narrowing down the options of the things that they are practicing, so they can very much focus on the narrow phrases. But also it fits with very familiar types of argument, very familiar types of discourse, which the students will know already, but maybe are just not employing with these phrases. And perhaps that is a lesson for how we might deal with grammar if we want to teach it to advanced learners, is focusing on the very narrow areas which they literally don't know how to use, and maybe practice them in very simple, narrow ways, and not expecting this multiple, grander practice.